What's up, people? Welcome to another edition of the New Breed Podcast, the world's best music podcast show, what have you, talking about everything brutal, new death, hard, slam, grind, thrash, core, metal. I didn't miss a genre there. I am one half of your hosting duo, Jay Horsecow. With me, I have my partner in crime, the notorious TIM, Tim Anderson. Tim Anderson Jr., how's it going?
Good.
All right, here we go. Can you tell Jay has had way too much fucking Mountain Dew today? All right, and joining us this week, we have a special guest to talk about a band that I'm hoping some of you have heard about. Maybe some of you haven't. And we're going to talk about all sorts of music stuff. Author, musician, Brian Paone. Brian, thank you for joining.
Hey, thank you for having me.
We are stoked. So for those of you listening, Brian wrote a book that I didn't even know existed until about, I think, a month and a half ago. And I immediately went out and bought it. And the title of the book is Dreams Are Unfinished Thoughts. My Memoirs of David Reilly by Brian Paone. So this is a story about Brian's I guess relationship, right? With David Reilly, friendship.
On Amazon, someone reviewed it as a broship. So,
okay. That's a good term. I got to remember that. His broship with the lead singer of a band which sadly has kind of fallen beside the wayside in the annals of history. God Lives Underwater. So, Brian, I guess I'll start off with this may be a loaded question to ask someone like you, but if you had to describe God Lives Underwater to our audience who has no idea what they sound like, how would you do it?
I would say I would say Depeche Mode with metal guitars, or I would even go as far as saying Stabbing Westward with more keyboards. It's like they walk a fine line, you know. It's hard to pinpoint them. And their keyboard sound, most of them were built from the ground up. They weren't pre-factory. Presets when you buy a Korg and it comes with 390 sounds and find the one that you like, right? You use it. And in God Lives Underwater, they like constructed their own sound banks. So the sounds, their keyboard, the synth and the keyboards in their songs, you're not going to hear in any other band because they built those. And that's what I think was setting them apart, you know? So
doesn't that come up at one point in the book, Brian, where you're having a conversation where you talk with David, where he talks about how there was a keyboard used for one of the songs that it falls out of the trailer. Yeah. It's basically lost to the sand. Now that song is lost to the sands of time.
Forever. So the second album, Empty, has a song on it called Tortoise, and they called it the Tortoise keyboard because it was the only piece in the world that created that sound. And they were unpacking before a show for a load-in, and I don't know which member of the band, but it slipped out of the back of the trailer and hit the roadway and shattered into like a million pieces. And they stood there and were like, well, there goes playing that song live ever again. I mean, they could, right? I mean, you can, there's workarounds, but they were like, well, that's the only piece in the world that holds the banks to that song, and it's over. So
what were they stored on back then? Like a actual floppy or?
That's a good question. There's an interview that David did that I transcribed and put word for word in the book, where the person who's interviewing him asks him that question, and he kind of goes into where they stored their sounds. Even though I am a musician at heart, I'm not very tech savvy when it comes to synths and stuff. So some of the terminology he was using kind of went over my head. And even though it's in the book, I was kind of copy and pasting an interview that had happened, right? So I wasn't expounding, on those words. But there was some of it that was backed up on some hard drives that they could interchange in and out of some of the synths. But for some reason, what they called the Tortoise keyboard, it was all internal memory banks.
Gotcha.
So when it fell and broke, when the hard drive shattered, it was gone. There was no backup anywhere.
Gotcha.
Yeah, and from what I remember from the interview about that keyboard, it was built by them using like Frankenstein pieces of older synths that like back from the 80s, because they wanted that 80s sound. And so it was before you could save shit and then, plug it into another synth or trigger and have it work correctly. So unfortunately, that's like the one keyboard in existence that they had, and it fell out of trailer.
These days you could use some backing tracks for that. Just take it right off the record.
Right.
Yeah, right. Oh, I know. I'm sure of, like, if they were still around and David hadn't passed, and they could have gone in the studio and got the masters from the record and isolated that track, and then boom, got the backing track. But we're talking about 96, 97, where that was still viable, but they just were like, well, the keyboard's broke. So
there is definitely some of our listening and watching audience going right now. What do you mean it was stored on the instrument and you didn't have like removable? Like there's obviously some of our fans are like, wait a minute, what? How old are these guys? What is this, like Jimmy Page and Robert Plant and shit? It's just kind of amusing. So so Brian, your book is an interesting story because it for those that haven't read it, starts out with Brian as a fan of this band, and it goes through the journey of you becoming friends with them, friends with David, the ups and downs of God Lives Underwater, the eventual dissolution. You were running point on David doing a solo show, and you were involved with him almost like like a bromance, not a bromance, but what was the term we used? Broship. And it was, I mean, it was really a cool story to read because and Tim, I'll lend you my copy next time I see you. It really is just you were hanging out outside the venue trying to meet the band and tell them you were big fans, and then fast forward a couple years later and the dude is actually sleeping on your floor.
Right. Yeah, it happened fast. And I think I can only assume and kind of put the missing pieces together that what was happening in David's head, right? Because I can't ask him now because he's gone. So I can only use the way he treated me to piece it together. But I honestly feel that because he got addicted to drugs, right? He became a heroin junkie, which is public knowledge. I'm not revealing anything that the family doesn't want to know or anything that this is. But I was in the music scene heavily, especially in the industrial scene heavily, right? And I was also in an industrial metal band myself. So I kind of knew the culture a bit, but I also had never done a drug in my life. So he looked at me as like a safe place, because most of his other friends, if he was trying to detox or come down, he would go hang out at people's houses, and there would be someone who would come over with some drugs. And next thing you know, he's doing drugs again, where I was kind of isolated. And I don't know if that's why our friendship blossomed the way it did, because there was never pressure when he came over. There was, he never knew I was going to be trying to get him to do, a line or anything, because I didn't have that. I didn't do it myself, So I don't know if I'd like to think that I got so far deep into being close to him on a personal level because he saw me as non-threatening, again, I'm only assuming. I don't know.
Right.
This is the things I'd like. This helps me sleep at night if I think that I was and his family too, right? So I don't want to take anything away from Gretchen and his parents, because they all did right by him also. But sometimes I think it's hard to admit your faults to your family, right? Yeah. So he would come to me, and say, "Hey, I'm struggling. I need a place to crash. Can and I would buy him a train ticket to come sleep on my floor so he could detox, because it was a safe place to be. He wasn't going to be around the junk." So
right.
Right. Brian, where are you from?
I am from I was born in Salem, Massachusetts, but I was born and raised in Lynn, Massachusetts.
Okay.
Which is the city next door. So, but I tell people Salem if you don't actually know the area.
How did you meet him, David? Because isn't he's from not far from where I am.
Yeah,
right?
Perkiomenville, right?
Yeah.
He's from Ambler, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, okay.
So I met him because a radio station, a Boston radio station, WBCN, was having a contest. Their call numbers are 104.1, or were. I don't even know if they're still in existence anymore, but they were 104.1 FM in Boston. So they were giving away 104 free tickets to a show at the Paradise Rock Club in Boston. And they were only allowing 104 people in. That was it. And the place holds, I could be off in my math because you could obviously Google it, but I think the Paradise holds up to like 800 people, but they were only letting 104 in. It was going to be a super intimate night. And it was God Lives Underwater. And they were on American Records at the time. Only their EP was out only their debut EP was out at the time. So Empty, which is the album that kind of, put them on the industrial map, hadn't even been released yet. So I think American Records, Rick Rubin produced the first 2 albums. And I think American Records were trying to create a buzz because 9 Inch Nails were exploding or had just exploded, right? Because this is 95. So we had Ministry was already kind of at the top of the game. And God Lives really was kind of fitting in that niche. They were kind of like 9 Inch Nails, but not as angry, right? So they were, but God Lives definitely could have toured with 9 Inch Nails, and it would have made sense. Like nobody would have been like, "Who the hell are these guys?" I mean, it would have made sense. So I think they had 104 things, and I was hanging out with my buddy, and they made the announcement on the radio, "Hey, 104 tickets only to tonight or tomorrow night show." I'd have to go back and look at the book to remember, but from God Lives Underwater, and I'd never heard of them, and neither had my friend Dave, and we were swimming in this pool, and they played No More Love, song No More Love, which is on the EP, which also then was in the Johnny Mnemonic soundtrack. So a lot of people, that was the gateway to God Lives, was the Johnny Mnemonic soundtrack, which No More Love was on, but it was also on the EP. So they played No More Love, and I remember it, like we were like 20 seconds into the song, into the opening synth riff, and I was like, oh my God. And then David started singing, and then the guitars kicked in, and I was just like, holy shit, these guys are like 9 Inch Nails. Like, because at the time, you're a teenager, and 9 Inch Nails, Downward Spiral had just come out, so you're all like, 9 Inch Nails are God, if you're into that, like if that's what you're doing, right? So I was like, oh my God, these are like 9 Inch Nails, and and they're coming, and 104 tickets. So I called in, and we won the tickets. We were 2 of the 104 people that got to go to the show. I was the whatever caller I was supposed to be. But we didn't have a copy of the EP. So we went like searching record stores in the area that might have a copy. And we found like 1 copy on a shelf of some random like used record store place. And me and my buddy bought the copy, and we OD'd on it for like the next 24 hours. So we would know every single song. The EP is only 6 tracks, right? It's like 24 minutes long, but I must listen to that, 1,000 times, because I was determined to like know every word. And I saw a picture of what they looked like, and we got to the show early, and we were the first ones at the door. So the show was at the Paradise, and we were the only ones there. Nobody had lined up yet. We were 2 idiots, 16-year-olds or whatever, just, standing there like, oh, well, we, like, this is uncool. Like, we're totally not fashionably late for this party. But they had just finished their sound check, and the door opens, and they walked out together, the 4 of them. And I only recognized David because of his nose ring. He had one of those like really thick, like nose rings. I described it like that a bull would have in like cartoons. And it was the only reason why I recognized him. And I ran up to him, and I was like, hey, are you David from God Lives Underwater? And he was like, yeah, man. He's like super happy that like somebody recognized him. The first tour, they only get an EP that's only sold in like 1% of stores. Johnny Mnemonic hadn't come out yet, so like that hadn't exploded. And he was like really, really psyched that like someone had recognized him and was able to put a name to a face in the band. And then when we got let in, we went right to the barrier, and I was underneath his microphone. This is gonna make me sound like such a fanboy. Gosh, it's like, well, this is embarrassing to like recount, because now I can look back and I'm like, oh my God, you're huge. But I was under the microphone. I made sure that I screamed every word back to them, right? I just wanted them to know that like I knew, I wanted, because the other 100 people in the crowd who had won tickets were just there because it was like a show, and they were more interested in drinking at the bar. So the show was really fucked up, because there was like all these people like hanging out the bar and talking, and then there's me and my buddy jumping up and down, pumping our fists and singing every word. So it was like, we're like, why isn't everybody else like super psyched too, right? And when they were done, Dave looks down at me and he's like, does one of these, like, come on. And we were like, what, us? What are we doing? You know, I mean, I'd never been backstage at a show before. In the book, I joke that I thought the backstage was going to be like a Motley Crue backstage. I thought there was going to be strippers on poles. I thought there was going to be, people doing line off people's boobs. I was like, oh my God, we're going backstage at a rock show. Yeah, that was super disappointing. They were all on couches drinking like Mountain Dew, just like, it was like, it was like, I was like, oh man, but we got backstage and David noticed that we were jumping around singing the songs. And then we helped them load their gear. Like, we stayed so long that when it was time for the club to kick them out, we started carrying gear. Like, we were carrying drum sets and amp. We were pushing shit to the trailer and loading. And he said to me, hey, just keep an eye out, because this is before the internet, right? This is 95. So I couldn't, no bands in town. No way to Polestar. There's no way to like follow a band to see when they're coming. Yeah. You had to just find it through natural means. So he's like, hey, next time we come through, make sure you find me or whatever. And I was like, okay, cool. And they came through again, opening for shit, I forget who they. Oh my God, I have to go back and look. But they came through as the opener for a way bigger industrial band at the time. Like, it was either KMFDM. I think it was KMFDM. So they were the opener for KMFDM. And I was nervous that you would remember me. I wouldn't get in. The show was sold out. I was like, oh shit, this isn't going to go the way I wanted to. But nope, David like immediately recognized me outside and like snuck me in the club. And we just never, that kind of started, like the fact that like I was his Boston. I was the one he had, so. And
it's awesome. It's awesome. And he seemed like, I mean, the fact that he remembered, right? Because like before we started recording, Tim, we were talking about Brian does all sorts of writers' workshops where he has a DeLorean he brings with him, and he'll sit in the DeLorean and take pictures of people. And I asked him, who was one of the people you've met that was like totally random, and he was talking about how Barry Bostwick was the coolest dude. He just came over and started chatting, and it was like two dudes sitting at a bar. And that just, when I read the book, that's how it sounded like you and David's friendship started, where it was like, yeah, we were just kind of two guys who shared some of the interests. And whenever he came through town, we'd hang out and, get a proverbial beer together. And it was just, it seems so awesome. And I think you're right, Brian, not to project, but I think probably one of the reasons that he probably enjoyed hanging out with you is you didn't have an ulterior motive. You were a fan of the shit that he was doing and you were just geeked out, hanging out, talking about that.
Yeah. And, something else is I did sometimes, they imposter syndrome. So mm-hmm. I don't really admit that in the book, but I did go through that a while because I said, I'm so much younger than him. Why would he want to hang out with me? Like, I'm not, I mean, he did dabble in drugs. I didn't do drugs. My band was still considered, the girl band on the street. Yeah, we played some local clubs, but we weren't, I wasn't signed to any major label. So I started I did go through a phase where I was like, why? Like, why does he care? Like, why does he want to hang out with me? Why does he search me out at shows to make sure I'm okay or I'm in the crowd or get me up on stage to watch the show side stage? That was something that I wrestled with. Like, what did I bring to the table?
Mm-hmm.
What was my benefit? What was he getting out of being friends with me? I know what I was getting out of it. I was getting out of the fact that I was becoming friends with, the singer, now one of my top 5 favorite bands in the history of music, because I became such a fan so fast that, so for me, that's what I was getting out. I was getting that kind of that high of being a fan and hanging out with,
mm-hmm.
Somebody that you look up to. But I went through quite a bit of time going like, what does he care about me? Like, and I look back on it now that I'm adult, right? Now I'm 46 years old, not 17 anymore. And now I kind of see that again. I think it went back to the fact that I kind of represented some sort of safe place for him, and I didn't ever freak out. There was no fanboying. I didn't pressure him. I never made him feel uncomfortable. And David always distanced himself from people who made him feel uncomfortable. If he had some sort of sensory overload, you know, that like, oh my God, those are the people he would actually go, whoa, I don't want to talk to you, you know, and because I think I never approached him that way. There was a sense of, you know, I do one thing that I say in the book, and I'll just touch on it real quickly, is this is going to make him sound like an asshole, but you have to understand the type of person he was. He actually disliked very much when people would come up to him and tell him what their favorite lyrics were of his and how it like saved them or it helped them through something. We all have those bands and those songs that we look back on in our life and be like, oh my God, I never would have made it through if I didn't have that album. I never would have made it through this if I didn't have this band's songs, right? But that put so much pressure on him that he was so socially awkward that when someone would say that to him, you could actually see his demeanor change. Instead of like embracing that, he kind of had this, no man, I can't, you know, I can't help anybody. I can't even myself. Like I don't, you're actually adding more stress to my life, telling me that my songs are saving you. Because what if they stop? What, you know, like I don't think I can live with that. And that's the type of person he was, you know. And I never approached him that way. So he knew he would break that from me. In fact, you know, I got to such a comfortable place with him. Sometimes I call him an asshole. Or I'd be like, "What are you, a fucking dickhead?" You know, come on, David. You know, so
sounds like he might have had up some of the imposter syndrome thing going on at that point. Maybe.
I think so. Yeah, looking back, I think so. I know he idolized a lot of the bands in the genre who were making it in better than his band was, than God Lives was. And I think he went through some times where he thought that he had no business even being, you know, part of that crew.
Yeah.
You know, he always doubted his talent and his songwriting stuff, you know.
Well, which is a shame because, I mean, Empty is fantastic. Life of the So-Called Space Age is fantastic. I mean, reading this book, I went back through, some memories. What was it, Huh Magazine?
Yeah, Magazine.
I completely forgot that thing existed.
Yeah, I loved Huh Magazine.
I read it in the book and I went, shit, that's how I found this band, because a good buddy of mine who has the antithetical music taste that I have now, which is so funny that I still mention him. He handed me the magazine. He's like, yo, check these guys out. We got to go get this EP, get in the car. But it was, I didn't even know this thing existed. It's not going to show up. I didn't even know this existed until you mentioned it in the book. And I was all over freaking eBay trying to find it because I couldn't even find it on Soulseek. And I was like, okay, gotta buy it. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting, fascinating story how you and him became really good friends, and you were with them through the rise. I mean, the tour with Space Hog, where they got kicked off because they were out drawing, which makes literally no sense.
Wow.
I know. Again, I don't want to speak ill of anybody or anything, right? That's the type of person I am. I'm pretty diplomatic, but Space Hog kicked them off the tour because Space Hog was headlining, God Lives was opening, and the place was empty because people were coming to see God Lives and then leaving because they didn't care about Space Hog. It was just it was not a very good match on a bill. That doesn't mean that Space Hog doesn't have their own good fans. It was that I think it was a poorly placed bill, and God Lives at the time was rising. Space Hog had kind of plateaued. And when God Lives wanted to flip-flop and start headlining, Space Hog was like, kick them off the tour.
Which is insane. You let them headline because you're getting paid regardless. You know?
So let me tell you, I want to shift genres real quickly and tell you about how different scenes treat bands, right? So there's a band called Sparta, who was a break off from At the Drive-In.
Yep.
And there's a band called Thursday. And Sparta was headlining the tour on their first album, Wiretap Scars, and Thursday was the opener. And Thursday, they started to see that more kids were coming to see Thursday's set than Sparta's set. And Sparta, halfway through the tour, actually were the ones who initiated asking if they would want to flip-flop their slot. They gave their headlining slot because they're like, kids are coming to see you. And they were smart enough to go, if we go on before you, that means that more people are going to watch us who don't know who we are.
Exactly.
Right. That was,
Mhm.
and I remember when I heard that happened, and it was one of those moments where it was like, that's good business sense.
Yeah.
You know, that's not being on your high horse. That's good business moves. I don't, but Space Hog didn't look at it that way. Their egos got bruised. That these people were, jerking off with their keyboards on stage, and more people will come in to see that. So,
Tim, I forget what other show we talked about? I saw, and I have big respect for bands that take out a younger band, that there's a chance that this younger band blows them off the stage, right? Like,
right.
I have the ultimate respect for that, because that's a baller move, because that's going to force you to play better. And I tell this story all the time. I saw Every Time I Die, one of their last tours, where they took out Knocked Loose. And this is when Knocked Loose was the big thing. And it was jam-packed for Knocked Loose. And then Every Time I Die came on, and there was still about half the room left. And,
Right.
they
Well,
come
they still
out.
have a fan. They still have a fan base,
Yeah.
no matter what.
And they did like 5 or 6 songs, and Keith is a wise ass who's like, "Yeah, I want to thank all of you for coming to the Knock Loose show and sticking around long enough to see us. I mean, hopefully we'll make some new fans." Like, he made a joke about it, but I mean, that's the right way to approach it, right? And JD Justice said it in one of those stupid interviews he did, where he's like, "Look, we're the headliner, we're getting paid regardless. I mean, you want to leave before us, that's fine. Then do your thing."
Well, look, I mean, if you think about it, you're gonna always, if you're that band that got pissed about it, you're always remembered for that now. Because look, it's 2023, we're talking about it right now. You know
right.
what I mean?
And now when I think of Space Hog, it's In the Meantime,
Right.
and them kicking Godless Order off a tour because they outdrew them. It's like, it's totally nuts. But yeah, I think a band should take somebody out who's gonna give you a run for their money.
Right. So and I agree with that. So like, I'm a big pool player, right? At billiards, and I always like playing against somebody who's better than me, because I'll never get better if I'm not playing against somebody who's gonna hand my ass to me at the end of the game. And I think I think all art kind of follows that, right? You want to play with a band. When I was in touring bands, we loved sharing the stage with bands who are just as energetic, push the envelope just as much, because it makes you not fall asleep. Because we would be like, oh fuck, like we got to go out there and jump twice as high, run twice as fast across that stage, because those dudes owned it, and now we got to go out and do our own thing. We can't fall asleep behind the wheel. And there was I think there were just some bands who they just want the like accolades to come to them without having to push forward in work. And Space Hog, again, I don't want to talk shit in case any this gets back to any of them, but they couldn't handle it and they kicked them off the tour.
It makes less than no sense to me. I mean, some of the best shows I've seen is where you have an up and coming band they have an established band as direct support, and then they get 2 younger bands who are going to push it, right? I mean, last time I saw Harm's Way, they had Ringworm as direct support, right? Who are probably old enough to be some of those guys in Harm's Way's dads, right? And then the other 2 support was Baltimore's Queensway and Vane. So they brought out young bands that were going to, that whole set, everybody was like, yo, we're here to put on a good time. It says something. It says something about the integrity of the artist.
I remember David telling me, I did not see these shows because these happened away from New England, but David told me how he took God Lives Out, and how like in Korn took God Lives Out in '96. So Korn had just released Life is Peachy, I believe. So they hadn't hit the Follow the Leader explosion yet, but they still had that, like that fan base was fucking huge, right? With Life is Peachy. And David told me just like how amazing those guys were. He was like, yeah, we were like the tech nerds of the tour, with our keyboards. He says, but they treated us like, we were equals. And he said, and he told me like the handful of shows, whatever that they opened for Korn, even though the music style was so different and the crowd was kind of different, he said that it was like family. So there's a sense of, we don't care who's selling the records. We don't care whose song is on the radio now. We don't care how many people came through the door to see which band. We're on a tour together. So that means we're brothers on this tour. And so I think that's the attitude. I think, we're in this, it's like a battle, right? We're all going in together.
Yeah.
And who cares who's sticking around for what band? We're all on the same bill.
Yep.
We're gonna fight for the next city. And David really was a big advocate of getting on tours with bands who had that mentality that we're all in this together. And they played with Slayer, right? They opened for Slayer. They've opened for, so I mean, they were just, God Lives had no airs about them at all. There was no pretentiousness. They were just happy to be on stage playing to even one person who would listen, and that followed them. That followed David even after God Lives broke up after the 4th album in his solo career. I mean, if 2 people came to see a solo show, he would make sure he came down and bought them a beer and chatted with them because he was so appreciative of anybody who would take money out of their wallet. And, like the Guns N' Roses song where he says, you're stealing money from these hard-earned kids, whatever it is like the Get in the Ring song. Axl Rose kind of goes on this rant in the song Get in the Ring. And I always think about that because as an artist, you have people who are spending their hard-earned money on your art, right? Like even as an author. So the last thing I want to do is piss anybody off. And that was David's philosophy. Like, I don't care if I play to 2 people. Those 2 people are the most important people in the world right now for the next 40 minutes. And, I'm going to play my ass off for them. And so I think that he had a lot of integrity, with that. However, there are some times when the sound man would piss them off and they would take it out on the crowd. There was one show in particular in Boston where they took all the keyboards, put as many loops on them as possible, turned the volume up as high as they could, and walked out to the van because they were, but the show was over. Like the crowd didn't miss any songs. They did the set. They did that to piss off the sound guy because the sound guy kept waiting for them to come back out and kill the keyboards. And they were like, fuck him. Just let him figure out when he should shut off the speakers. So that I always thought that was funny, but the crowd didn't get any less of a show. And that was more finger towards the sound guy.
So Brian and I had a conversation before we actually recorded this episode, just to give him a little bit of homework. And Brian and I went down the rabbit hole. We actually started talking about a whole bunch of different stuff. And I think I made the remark to Brian that I am convinced that God Lives Underwater is one of those bands that in today's day and age with the internet, right? I think they would have been huge based solely upon the fact that the internet makes it easy for bands that don't, the internet makes it vastly easier for bands that don't exactly fit a particular niche to get their music out there, right? Because I mean, look at the Deftones, right? The Deftones, phenomenal band, right? Every album except for, what's the one you hate, Tim? Gore? Is that the one that everybody hates?
Yeah.
But they built a fan base from doing different stuff. And when people say, what do the Deftones sound like? You're kind of like, the Deftones. Like, God Lives Underwater is the same thing where that's why I asked you, Brian, and you were kind of like, well, maybe it's this and maybe it's that, because they had a very unique sound. And nowadays that would have probably helped them see through the massive amount of music that comes out at a weekly clip. It's you can't even keep up.
Yeah. I keep waiting for somebody to sound like God Lives Underwater's keyboard sound. And I think because they didn't use pre-programmed banks in their songs, that you will never find anybody who sounds like them. And that doesn't mean that they're like geniuses. It just means that they created all their keyboard sounds. So, it's funny. This is I'm gonna reference two artists right now real quick. Gary Newman, I love Gary Newman. I'm going to see him live for the very first time in my life next month, so I'm like really excited. But I love Gary Newman. Respect him for what he's done in the industrial and electronic world, right? But there's an album from the 80s, late 80s, where the sounds he's using on almost every song, I had on my Korg in my bedroom in the early 90s, like when I was fucking around writing songs. Like I just knew that he did, and it was like, that sounds cool. We're gonna put this on the album, and just started pressing keys. And then there's a band called Babylon Zoo from the UK, industrial band. And again, not a single note of keyboard or synth was built by them. Everything you could is a patch that you could find that comes from any keyboard anywhere, right? It sounded cool at the time, but now when you listen to it, it's dated because like, oh my God, I know that's setting 36. Like I even remember the number of the keyboard sound they're using on this keyboard. And God Lives, like they didn't do that. They didn't use any store-bought pre-programmed sounds. You know, they went out and sampled stuff in the wild, or they recorded and plugged in, recorded tape, manipulated it, put it, you know, and then put into a keyboard, use the pitch shifter, use the whatever, and manipulate the sound. So all of a sudden, like it's theirs. And that's why for anybody listening or watching this podcast, God Lives Underwater, whether you like that style of music or not, you will not find another band who has that tone because they created it, right? They created the tone of their songs. And it's weird because sometimes I would think about it, and the name of the band, God Lives Underwater, is such an odd name. But if you listen to their songs, all their keyboard synths, at least in the EP and Empty, sound like keyboard riffs coming from underwater.
Mm-hmm.
They have this like bubbly sound a lot, like, and it sounds like shit's coming up from the depths of something. It's really weird how their name almost sounds like what the keyboard sound. You know, I know we got into Life in So-Called Space Age, and that was kind of more a little bit more I don't know,
approachable almost.
Yeah, approachable. You know, it was funny because I was talking to a friend one day about that album, who's a big God Lives Underwater fan. And I made the comment that there was no guitars on that album. And my buddy Dan was like, oh my God, you're right. That's why you're right. There's no, but you don't notice there's no guitars on the album because so many of the keyboard riffs on that record are heavy. And when you realize that none of that's actually coming from like guitar being plugged into an amp, that all came from like synthesized guitar stuff. Like, holy shit, they wrote a rock album with no real guitars. Like, oh my God, you know? But they were so good at fooling you, you know, into being like, you know, a semi-industrial metal band where the guitars weren't the predominant instrument, you know? Like Ministry. You take the guitars out of any Ministry album from Psalm 69 on, and you know, it probably still have some cool songs, but you're going to notice that the guitars are missing, right?
Yeah.
And God Lives was really great at removing guitars, and you didn't notice that it's still not a heavy song anymore, you know?
So let me ask you, Brian, you said you're always listening for another band to sound of this nature, right? You're waiting for the next one. In your experience, who has come closest? Is there any band that came close where you said almost but not quite?
Skold's debut solo album, Tim Skold.
Okay.
He was a guitarist for Marilyn Manson for a while. He was the guitarist for KMFDM for a while.
Yeah.
Tim Skold's self-titled debut album, I truly believe could be put up against a God Lives album, and it would work. Like it was, I mean, he's got a little bit more attitude in his guitar playing. He's a little more he got more punk style in there. But I feel like his album could be a God Lives record. Now, I'm going to go so off the grid here with this, and this is going to sound crazy, and you might have to live in my head to understand where I'm coming. But I don't know if you ever heard of a band called Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yep.
Their first album, The Gato Hunch, which has Cansado on it, which is like the song that, like, right? That album to me could have been a God Lives album if there was like slightly more keyboard.
I got to go back and listen to that because I haven't heard the Stanford. I haven't even heard the name, the Stanford Prison Experiment, in ages. Okay.
See, you bring me on the show, and I'm going to throw some really weird shit at you. So if you listen to Empty and go right into Stanford Prison Experiment, that album, and you kind of envision a little bit more keyboards in it, the attitude, the tone, the staccato, the kind of iambic pentameter of the vocals, it's all very similar. In fact, the reason why I say this is because I found Stanford Prison Experiment because WFNX in Boston played Cansato on the radio. I had never heard of Stanford Prison Experiment, and I thought it was a New God Lives Underwater song. Right? It fooled me. And I messaged David, and I was like, he's like, no, that's not us at all. I didn't know what you're talking about. But so and then I bought the album, and I was like, oh my God, like they're like a punk post-hardcore band that could be an industrial band if they had more keyboards in their songs. So
that is, I would never have put that together, but I'm definitely going to listen to that right after this, because now you really have piqued my curiosity. My little brother was a big, my little brother was a big fan. We shared the same music taste. I sadly never got to see God Lives Underwater live. He saw them with somebody at, I think it was Coney Island High in New York.
Mm-hmm. I played there
and
with my bands.
It's funny. I do want to talk about music. Coney Island High, but it was not on Coney Island, and it wasn't a high school. It was a hovel. Yeah. It was a hovel.
Yeah.
And I think a fight broke out, and they only lasted 5 songs. And they got off the stage because a fight broke out. And funnily enough, the fight that broke out was one of my best friends was there with my brother, and he got punched in the face by some random dude. So I'm like, the whole story is kind of wild. But I do want to ask about that, Brian. So you had a musical career too as well, right? I mean, you've done some punk stuff, some industrial stuff. Can we talk a little bit about that? So like, what are you doing anything these days? Has that ship has sailed and you're concentrating on writing? What's going on?
So it's interesting you ask if that ship has sailed. I'll kind of crawl up to that. So the first band I was ever in was an industrial band called Yellow Number One. We put out 2 albums, and the goal of that band was to sound like Mr. Bungle meets Flock of Seagulls. I don't know. Like, let's do like silly synth pop, and let's do some weird avant-garde like time changes and stuff, right? So we opened for Godsmack. That's kind of like one of our biggest claims to fame. So we put out 2 records, and when I was in that band, there was a band in the area being formed called Dropkick Jesus. And it was a hardcore band. We were together for 5 years. We also put out 2 albums. But we got to tour with Vision of Disorder, Will Haven, Bile, Crisis, Clay People.
So basically you toured with the Mortal Kombat soundtrack, basically.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Sam Blackchurch, Scissor Fight Tree, Propane, Crowbar. I could just list all these people that we toured with, but that was the genre we were in. And I was the singer. And we broke up in 2001, and then myself and the bass player from Dropkick Jesus started a new band called The Grave Machine, which would be my 3rd band. We put out 1 album, and our idea for that was, let's make an industrial metal band so focused around horror movies. So we were very much, we wanted us to be like a Neurosis meets Mine's a Terrible Thing to Taste Ministry meets Pink Floyd. So there was a lot of samples. We took samples from like Pit and the Pendulum, the movie May, War of the Worlds, Amityville Horror. So all of our songs were very horror steeped, very, I don't know if you know Mine's a Terrible Thing to Taste, but there's a song on the album called The Dream Song.
Yep. That's
like my bass player's blueprint for that band.
Okay.
If you took, basically it would be like if you took the Dream Song by Ministry and let Neurosis cover it, that's what we wanted to sound like, right?
What a mental picture.
Yeah, so that was our album. That was our band. And the only reason why we broke up was because my band, The Grave Machine, actually opened for a band called Coven of 13 in New Hampshire. They were a goth metal band. We were on tour. We had New Hampshire, then New York next. But I wound up marrying the singer of Coven of 13. And I had never seen her before in my life, before that show. We were on stage doing our sound check because we were the openers. Coven of 13 had a little bit bigger draw in New Hampshire than Grave Machine did. So the club as the headliners. It was a Halloween show. And so I joke and I say that it was love at first sound check because, I was on stage doing our line check because we were the opening act. And I remember my now wife, walking through the side door with, and I was like, oh my God, she's so cute. Who's that? Oh, it's the singer of the band. And of course, the singer of a like goth metal band who's a female, of course, attracts all guys, and I remember the show, You know, it was like all the guys were oogling over her. And, you know, I made a joke to my guitarist. I said, hey, I'm going to marry her. You know, I was like kidding, kind of. And then I actually wound up marrying her, and we have 4 kids now, and we've been together almost 20 years. But regardless, but the reason why Grave Machine broke up was because my wife joined the Navy. So she got stationed down in Jacksonville, Florida. So unfortunately, you know, when you're married to the military, you have to move. And, you know, my wife more to me than the band. And the bass player from the Grave Machine and Dropkick Jesus, he's still my best friend. Even though I moved, you know, we had to work it out in our own way, but, you know, I would take a bullet for that guy. So, you know, there was no love loss, the fact that I kind of walked away from our career. But when I moved to down to Florida, when she got stationed in Jacksonville, I started a new band called Transpose. And we wound up being together for years, and we put out 2 albums, and we toured. We opened for we played with Mushroomhead. We played with, you know. So again, here I'm in another new band, and we're getting billed on all these other, like, you know, names. Transpose has never officially broken up, and this goes back to, like, you know, has the ship sailed? Our last tour was in 2013, so it's been 10 years this year that we've played together, done anything. However, oddly enough, the fact that we're talking about this, I've been in discussions with my bass player from Transpose that we are looking at possibly doing a small East Coast tour in February of 2024. If it goes well, you know, we're going to open up the discussions for, you know, do we put this thing back together? Do we, you know, is there a 3rd album in our works? You know, because music is such a part of my bloodstream that I don't know if, you know, the ship will ever sail.
Right.
You know, it could be years and years, but does the ship ever, is it just a ghost ship kind of circling the harbor waiting to get back on it?
It reconstitutes in different, you know, it's like an orbit, right? It's going to come closer and go further away. Well, if you guys do tour, if you're coming through Philly, please give us an advance notice. Tim and I will definitely we'll leave the house.
Yeah, that would be great. But my, you know, my author career really took off. I did not expect it to, but it did. And like, I have 8 published novels now.
Wow.
My 9th book is coming out later this year, which is going to be my very first collection of short stories, because I've only written novels up until now. So, and I tour back in the music world, but I do conventions, I do book festivals, I do writers conferences. I get hired to speak in front of up and coming authors who want to learn about the craft. So, you know, I get hired to be the guest speaker at conventions. I'm featured guests at a lot of the book festivals, conventions, and the writing thing. It's funny because I've said this to David's sister Gretchen a couple times. I said, you know, I'd always wanted to be an author. That was kind of like my dream. When I was a kid, if you asked me when I was a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would have given you 3 things immediately without thinking. I would have said, I want to be an author like Stephen King, because he was like my idol. I want to be in a super rock band, you know, where I'm a superstar, and I want to be a police officer. Like, that was the 3 things I would list off without even thinking about it. I want to be an author, a singer, and a police officer. And the author thing, I always felt was always going to be like the back burner, and the music world was going to be my ticket to fame. I always thought I was going to be the famous singer, right? That's really I mean, if you read the book, so much of my side stories are around my music, not like my writing. I just like, because to me, the music was always the big thing. But so David dying, which up until David's death, I had never written a book. I had only written short stories. I had written I had been writing short stories for years, and I'd always one day wanted to be an author, like a novelist. And I'd never written a novel before. And I talk about this in the book a little bit. When he died, I didn't know where to put the grief. Like, I didn't know how to plug in. It was such a weird time for me with his death, because you know, it's not like I grew up with the guy. I didn't live next door to him. We were so close, but it was at such a distance of space. And I got really, you know, if we're gonna like drop the curtain and kind of go honest here in the show, I really started drinking way too much. I started again, like I've never done drugs, but I turned to alcohol pretty bad. I didn't know what to do. And,
Right.
And I made I went down some dark roads. And that's going to sound weird. You can be like, oh my God, you didn't really know this guy that is like, he's just a singer of a band. But I had spent so much time trying to get him clean and keep him clean that I felt like a failure after 11 years of friendship. So I didn't know what to do with those emotions. Like I didn't know what is, it was kind of like a power line that's been cut, that's on the ground. You see them do this.
Yep.
And people are, you don't know how to grab the power line, and you're afraid if you do grab it, you're going to get shocked. So I floundered for a while, and in a very unhealthy way when he died, because I was questioning, could I have done more, and my roommate at the time, I was engaged to my wife at the time. Me and Stephanie were engaged. We were not living together, but I did have a roommate, and I kind of like just like broke down and was like, I don't know what the fuck to do with like how I'm feeling about this. It's been months, and I'm not like, why am I not over this guy's death? She's like, you're a writer. Why don't you just write about it? Just write about it. Like, I can't believe you haven't thought of this yet. Like, what are you, an idiot? Like McFly, and so I started writing, and as I wrote, it was therapeutic. And then I said, I wonder how many other people in the world are God Lives Underwater fans who might want to know a different side of him, might want to know the circumstances around his death, might, want to know what someone like me went through after he died. And it wound up turning into my first honest to God novel. So I published it, and it just fucking exploded. We were back in the MySpace days. I sold like 2,000 copies of this book out of the gun, and just through MySpace advertising. There was no such thing as like self-publishing on Amazon yet or anything like this.
Yeah.
It's just the fans around the world got wind that a book had been written about God Lives in David, and they came to me. And then my second book came out in 2010. Welcome to Parkview, which is a horror novel, but that was my first like fiction novel. So my wife was like, God, this may have kickstarted your career. And so I used to joke with his sister. I said, this is going to sound terrible, and don't take this the wrong way, but David's death, may have kickstarted my writing career.
Yeah.
And I'm saying the utmost respect and love for the man, right? That sounds terrible on paper. Like if I wrote that on paper, I would hate that, that I wrote that. But I truly feel that like David's death is why like I am where I am as an author today. Because I don't think I ever would have written the first book, that taught me that I can write a book. And so, I'd like to think that, I don't know, he's,
it's almost like a cosmic gift, right? Him leaving you, he gave back all the support you gave him with.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, man, the world works in kind of mysterious ways. You kind of just got to go with it and see. But I mean, and I remember when I found out that he passed, I remember being heartbroken, but also heartbroken because it seemed like something so simple, right? It was an abscess, right? That he had a tooth infection and his heart couldn't take it. Like, that's one of those things where to go out with an overdose is one thing, but to go out with something so mundane that could get any the tragedy of it is it really was like heartbreaking. Like, really?
Well, the worst part was that he was clean and working as a counselor at a local like meth clinic to help junkies get clean. The guy finally fucking turned his life around. And the universe is like, nope, boop, you're gone. That's what, and I think maybe that is another reason why I walked around like a zombie, not knowing what to do with my grief. Because you gotta be fucking kidding me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we have done so much to get this guy where he is, and a stupid tooth infection is gonna kill him. Yeah. It was one of those really, this has got to be a joke.
Mm-hmm.
You're waiting for the punchline. I'm a huge football fan. I'm an NFL fanatic. And whenever the team that's playing against my team, the Patriots, they score a touchdown, I always wait for the flag. Because I'm always like, no, that can't be true. Nope. And that's how I felt about David's death. I was like, where's the flag? Like, where's the penalty? Like this is getting called back. You know, like we're gonna do the play over again because this did not happen. And you know, it did, and it's crazy that it happened that way.
Brian, you didn't talk about this in the book, but have you heard from any of the other guys in the band? Like, are they?
Oh yeah.
Like, has there ever been any talk of like maybe we should do a tribute or something? Like,
no, but so I will take this opportunity to plug. So Andrew, the guitarist of God Lives Underwater, is in a band with the bass player from Rancid and the drummer from Jello Biafra's band. They're called Charger. They're they're kind of like they're like a Motorhead. They're like a modern day Motorhead, and so they call Charger. They have 2 albums out, and I had not seen Andrew since the last time I saw God Lives Underwater live, at the end of the Life in the So-Called Space Age cycle, which was '98. And so now he's in the band with it's the singer from Rancid. Why can't I remember his name?
Tim Armstrong, right?
Yes, Tim. It's Tim. Thank you. So it's Drew from God Lives, Tim from Rancid, and the drummer from Jello Biafra, and in this band called Charger. And they were playing San Francisco, and we were living in Monterey at the time. And Drew sent me a message, and he's like, "Hey man, Brian," he's like, "You know, Charger's playing in San Fran. You know, come on down." You know, it's like it's been fucking like how many years? Like 25, 30 years, right? So I took my 2 teenagers. My daughter, Annalise, her middle name is Reilly, after David, and spelled the same way, which is Reilly, not like the cutesy girl name Riley. You know, so Annalise's middle name is actually David's last name, and my wife's due date with Annalise was David's death date, which is fucked up.
Wow.
Right? So, again, like serendipity, like in the universe is all working. So when we found out that my wife's due date was the anniversary of David's death date, Stephanie was like, "Well, you know what? Let's make Annalise's middle." We already picked her first name. She's like, "Let's make her middle name after David." So that's why Annalise has, you know, Reilly as her middle name. Anyway, so Drew reached out to me and is like, "Hey, we're playing San Francisco. You know, I know your 2 oldest are, you know, old enough to go to like, you know, punk shows, you know, bring them out." So I brought Annalise and Everett. We had backstage passes. I mean, we walked through that place like we owned it, right? And this Tim from Rancid, and if you're a Rancid fan, like that's kind of a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm not a Rancid fan, not because I don't like them, but it's just not like they never hit that bone with me. But I completely like respect and understand like how important they are in what they've done. So I'm not down talking. It's just me. But they, you know, they come out, and Drew, when he saw me, because it'd been since '98 when, you know, Life on the So-Called Space Age tour, he gave me this hug, and I almost felt him. It was like happiness and almost this like almost like he was holding back crying, seeing me, because I'd been there for so much of God Lives shows and through their time. Like I represented David a little bit. Like, you know, of course, he not only did he knew I wrote the book, he had a copy of the book, he had read the book. So I think I was representing David for the first time to him, and he held me like a little bit longer than I think, you know, a normal hug would be. And there was this like silent like moment we had. And so then when they went to hit the stage, they were the headliners, and they sold the place out. Like they're like, I'm telling you right now, I hope you like write that down. Check out Charger.
Yep.
Because if you like Motorhead, like that like style of metal, they're perfecting it. It is like Motorhead of like a modern day Motorhead. They're amazing. But the show was sold out. So Drew, in like old God Lives fashion, like invited me to like kind of stand up, not necessarily side stage, but like a step or 2 up the steps to the stage. So we were away from like the craziness, because people were packed like sardines in there for them. Well, Tim from Rancid looks down, sees my 2 kids, Annalise and Everett, kind of on the steps, and he's like, no. And Tim brought them up to stand next to him for the whole show.
That's
so like,
awesome.
Annalise and Everett just stood next to Tim from Rancid, you know, for the, I mean, it's a Charger show, but they stood next to him. And then when the show was over, he gave them both picks from that he had played during the show. And then we all went out back and we ate together. We went backstage and just,
That's awesome.
it was so yeah. So Drew, that's my experiences with Drew, and I keep in touch with him actually. To be honest with you, he's such a good guy, and Charger is so amazing. And I'm not just saying that because I like Drew and he was the guitarist of God Lives Underwater. If they're just so fucking good. Adam, the drummer from God Lives, he has kind of comes in and out of local bands. Every once in a blue moon, I'll get a message from him, out of the blue. I'll get an email. It's nothing specific, but he tries to keep in touch, which is kind of nice. Jeff Turzo. I've been friends with him on Facebook since 2008, but he has really, really put a big long arm between himself and David and God Lives. And all that. He had a real hard time with David's death. He had a real hard time with David's addiction. There's a lot of internal stuff he's, I think, still trying to work out. I do not impede on that man's personal space. I do not impede on his emotions. I do not reach out to him. We have not talked. We do this passive friendship where we like each other's stuff on Facebook. But I have not spoken to him because I'm respecting the fact I think he wants some space, and just knowing that we every once in a while like each other's posts is enough for me. But me and Jeff have had absolutely no communication since the band broke up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody deals with things different ways, I mean, it is to each their own. So I have one more question for you, Brian, because I want to be cognizant of your time. So we started off this conversation talking about how God Lives Underwater is one of these bands that may or may not kind of get lost through the sands of time. What are some, if you like God Lives Underwater, even if our audience has never heard God Lives Underwater, what are some other bands from that era that you think people should pay attention to? Maybe they never got their moment in the sun. Maybe they shouldn't be forgotten because they really were do something that was either ahead of their time or really truly unique. What are some of the things that you would pull out of your record collection and say, okay, you got to listen to this, you got to listen to that?
I would say there's a band called The Hunger from Texas.
Okay.
Their big album was Devil Thumbs a Ride. An industrial band that I think was way, way better, but they got lost in the second, third generation wave of industrial metal bands when it was kind of becoming not cool. The tide was turning. But man, they are just amazing. Machines of Love and Grace, again, is a band I think people know because of the Crow soundtrack. But their talent is way beyond that, what they have on the Crow soundtrack. So we're talking about bands that people wouldn't normally know, right? Acumen Nation. There's a band called Acumen Nation that were signed by Invisible Records, Martin Atkins' label, and they're absolutely phenomenal. It blows my mind that those guys didn't they were like Pitch Shifter, Static X, Powerman 5000E, but I don't know, not as gimmicky. No, Pitch Shifter's not gimmicky, so remove them, take them out of the mix because I love Pitch Shifter. I would go to bat.
I'm a big fan. Big fan.
Yeah, I would go to bat with for John any day. So I take them out of what I'm saying. But they were less I know Acumen Nation were doing their own punk thing with industrial. They're almost like a punk industrial band. Okay. Kind of if the Sex Pistols had found programming, that's kind of Acumen Nation. So so yeah, that's I think that's where I would go down.
Okay, good. Some good obscure picks there. We have some crate diving to do. If it's not on streaming, Tim and I will be scrolling Spotify, and we fell in with a Discord group of a bunch of I don't want to insult them and call them kids, but they are kids. They're all in their early 20s. who relish the fact that if you can send them something that they can't find online, they will attack it with reckless abandon. And I will just mention like, hey, there's a band from San Diego called Tribal Disco Noise. I'm trying to find that first LP. Somebody will go diving somewhere and find it. So it's almost like a challenge to send these
That's
kids,
great.
hey, try and find this kind of weird shit. So Brian, to wrap, if people want to get a copy of the book and check out some of your other books, your music, where do they go? Where do they find you?
Sure. So if you want to check out any of my books are available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook worldwide. Everywhere books are sold. It doesn't if it sells an audiobook, if it sells an ebook, if it sells a paperback, it's there. And online. So we're talking about Walmart, Target, Barnes & Nobles, Amazon, Audible, iTunes, Books A Million. I am everywhere with all of my novels. They are everywhere. However, if you want any of my music, so any what I consider my 4 bands, Yellow Number 1, Dropkick Jesus, Grave Machine, and Transpose, all on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube. But here's the caveat. If you go to my website, which is brianpaone.com, it's my name.com, BrianPaone, all of my books and all of my music has been centralized, streamlined right to that site. All of my music is free. It's all of 4 of my bands, all the albums we ever released, you can download right from my site for free. And all of my books are there also as paperbacks. If you buy a paperback from my website, I sign it, which is the only place you can get a signed copy. And you can also download an ebook and the audiobook for way cheaper than any other store. My audiobooks are $6.99 on my website. Audible is charging $24.99 for the same audiobook.
Wow.
So I'm on Audible because as an author, that's my livelihood. But I'm also going, fuck you. I'm going to do $6.99 on my own website. So that's how we rock and roll.
Oh, awesome. Awesome. So, I mean, on behalf of Tim, myself, Brian, we want to thank you for coming on. This has been a fantastic conversation. Hopefully the start of many, many more. So I want to thank you for coming on. I want to thank all of our listeners, watchers for tuning in, watching and listening once again. NewBreed_podcast, both Twitter and Instagram, newbreedpodcast@gmail.com for all your complaints, questions, comments, or concerns. And lastly, find us on our Facebook group. The meme game on our New Metal Facebook group is getting pretty good. There's definitely been an uptick in quality Limp Bizkit memes. I will leave it at that.
Is it because of the way he looks?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And that the interview he just did with Bill Maher, which was really kind of a really, really fascinating insight into how he thinks. Never would have thought I'd be sitting through listening to Bill Maher conversation. But anyway, so we want to thank everybody for tuning in, listening, watching. And until next time, this is the New Breed Podcast saying cheers.
See ya.
Thank you.